There is excitement in the Veneering mansion. The mature young lady is going to be married, powder and all, to the mature young gentleman, and she is to be married from the Veneering house, and the Veneerings are to give the breakfast. The analytical, who objects as a matter of principle to everything that occurs on the premises, necessarily objects to the match, but his consent has been dispensed with, and a spring van is delivering its load of greenhouse plants at the door, in order that tomorrow's feast may be crowned with flowers. The mature young lady is a lady of property. The mature young gentleman is a gentleman of property. He invests his property. He goes, in a condescending amateurish way, into the city, attends meetings of directors, and has to do with traffic in shares. As is well known to the wise in their generation, traffic in shares is the one thing to have to do with in this world. Have no antecedents, no established character, no cultivation, no ideas, no manners, have shares. Have shares enough to be on boards of direction in capital letters, oscillate on mysterious business between London and Paris, and be great. Where does he come from? Shares. Where is he going to? Shares. What are his tastes? Shares. Has he any principles? Shares. What squeezes him into Parliament? Shares. Perhaps he never of himself achieved success in anything, never originated anything, never produced anything? Sufficient answer to all, shares. Oh mighty shares! To set those blaring images so high, and to cause a smaller vermin, as under the influence of henbane or opium, to cry out, night and day, relieve us of our money, scatter it for us, buy us and sell us, ruin us, only we beseech ye take rank among the powers of the earth, and fatten on us. While the Loves and Graces have been preparing this torch for Hymen, which is to be kindled tomorrow, Mr. Twemlow has suffered much in his mind. It would seem that both the mature young lady and the mature young gentleman must indubitably be Veneering's oldest friends. Wards of his, perhaps? Yet that can scarcely be, for they are older than himself. Veneering has been in their confidence throughout, and has done much to lure them to the altar. He has mentioned to Twemlow how he said to Mrs. Veneering, Anastasia, this must be a match. He has mentioned to Twemlow how he regards Sophronia Akersham, the mature young lady, in the light of a sister, and Alfred Lammle, the mature young gentleman, in the light of a brother. Twemlow has asked him whether he went to school as a junior with Alfred. He has answered, not exactly. Whether Sophronia was adopted by his mother? He has answered, not precisely so. Twemlow's hand has gone to his forehead with a lost air. But, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Twemlow, sitting over his newspaper, and over his dry toast and weak tea, and over the stable-yard in Duke Street, St. James's, received a highly perfumed cocked hat and monogram from Mrs. Veneering, entreating her dearest Mr. T, if not particularly engaged that day, to come like a charming soul and make a fourth at dinner with dear Mr. Podsnap, for the discussion of an interesting family topic, the last 3 words doubly underlined and pointed with a note of admiration. And Twemlow replying, not engaged, and more than delighted, goes, and this takes place. My dear Twemlow, says Veneering, your ready response to Anastasia's unceremonious invitation is truly kind, and like an old friend. You know our dear friend Podsnap? Twemlow ought to know the dear friend Podsnap who covered him with so much confusion, and he says he does know him, and Podsnap reciprocates. Apparently, Podsnap has been so wrought upon in a short time, as to believe that he has been intimate in the house many years. In the friendliest manner he is making himself quite at home with his back to the fire, executing a statuette of the Colossus at Rhodes. Twemlow has before noticed in his feeble way how soon the Veneering guests become infected with the Veneering fiction. Not, however, that he has the least notion of its being his own case. Our friends, Alfred and Sophronia, pursues Veneering the veiled prophet, our friends Alfred and Sophronia, you will be glad to hear, my dear fellows, are going to be married. As my wife and I make it a family affair, the entire direction of which we take upon ourselves, of course our first step is to communicate the fact to our family friends. Oh, thinks Twemlow, with his eyes on Podsnap, then there are only two of us, and he's the other. I did hope, Veneering goes on, to have had Lady Tippins to meet you, but she is always in request, and is unfortunately engaged. Oh, thinks Twemlow, with his eyes wandering, then there are three of us, and she's the other. Mortimer Lightwood, resumes Veneering, whom you both know, is out of town, but he writes, in his whimsical manner, that as we ask him to be bridegroom's best man when the ceremony takes place, he will not refuse, though he doesn't see what he has to do with it. Oh, thinks Twemlow, with his eyes rolling, then there are four of us, and he's the other. Boots and Brewer, observes Veneering, whom you also know, I have not asked today, but I reserve them for the occasion. Then, thinks Twemlow, with his eyes shut, there are si, but here collapses and does not completely recover until dinner is over and the analytical has been requested to withdraw. We now come, says Veneering, to the point, the real point, of our little family consultation. Sophronia, having lost both father and mother, has no one to give her away. Give her away yourself, says Podsnap. My dear Podsnap, no. For three reasons. Firstly, because I couldn't take so much upon myself when I have respected family friends to remember. Secondly, because I am not so vain as to think that I look the part. Thirdly, because Anastasia is a little superstitious on the subject and feels averse to my giving away anybody until baby is old enough to be married. What would happen if he did? Podsnap inquires of Mrs. Veneering. My dear Mr. Podsnap, it's very foolish I know, but I have an instinctive presentiment that if Hamilton gave away anybody else first, he would never give away baby. Thus Mrs. Veneering, with her open hands pressed together, and each of her 8 aquiline fingers looking so very like her one aquiline nose that the brand new jewels on them seem necessary for distinction's sake. But, my dear Podsnap, quoth Veneering, there is a tried friend of our family who, I think and hope you will agree with me, Podsnap, is the friend on whom this agreeable duty almost naturally devolves. That friend, saying the words as if the company were about 150 in number, is now among us. That friend is Twemlow. Certainly, from Podsnap. That friend, Veneering repeats with greater firmness, is our dear good Twemlow. And I cannot sufficiently express to you, my dear Podsnap, the pleasure I feel in having this opinion of mine and Anastasia's so readily confirmed by you, that other equally familiar and tried friend who stands in the proud position, who proudly stands in the position, or I ought rather to say, who places Anastasia and myself in the proud position of himself standing in the simple position of baby's godfather. And, indeed, Veneering is much relieved in mind to find that Podsnap betrays no jealousy of Twemlow's elevation. So, it has come to pass that the spring van is strewing flowers on the rosy hours and on the staircase, and that Twemlow is surveying the ground on which he is to play his distinguished part tomorrow. He has already been to the church, and taken note of the various impediments in the aisle, under the auspices of an extremely dreary widow who opens the pews, and whose left hand appears to be in a state of acute rheumatism, but is in fact voluntarily doubled up to act as a money-box. And now Veneering shoots out of the study wherein he is accustomed, when contemplative, to give his mind to the carving and gilding of the pilgrims going to Canterbury, in order to show Twemlow the little flourish he has prepared for the trumpets of fashion, describing how that on the 17th instant, at St. James's Church, the Reverend assisted by the Reverend united in the bonds of matrimony, Alfred Lamell Esquire, of Sackville Street, Piccadilly, to Sophronia, only daughter of the late Horatio Akersham, Esquire, of Yorkshire. Also how the fair bride was married from the house of Hamilton Veneering, Esquire, of Stucconia, and was given away by Melvin Twemlow, Esquire, of Duke Street, St. James's, second cousin to Lord Snigsworth, of Snigsworthy Park. While perusing which composition, Twemlow makes some opaque approach to perceiving that if the Reverend and the Reverend fail, after this introduction, to become enrolled in the list of Veneering's dearest and oldest friends, they will have none but themselves to thank for it. After which, appears Sophronia, whom Twemlow has seen twice in his lifetime, to thank Twemlow for counterfeiting the late Horatio Akershem Esquire, Broadley of Yorkshire. And after her, appears Alfred, whom Twemlow has seen once in his lifetime, to do the same and to make a pasty sort of glitter, as if he were constructed for candlelight only, and had been let out into daylight by some grand mistake. And after that, comes Mrs. Veneering, in a pervadingly aquiline state of figure, and with transparent little knobs on her temper, like the little transparent knob on the bridge of her nose, worn out by worry and excitement, as she tells her dear Mr. Twemlow, and reluctantly revived with curaçao by the analytical. And after that, the bridesmaids begin to come by railroad from various parts of the country, and to come like adorable recruits enlisted by a sergeant not present, for, on arriving at the Veneering depot, they are in a barack of strangers. So, Twemlow goes home to Duke Street, St. James's, to take a plate of mutton broth with a chop in it, and a look at the marriage service, in order that he may cut in at the right place tomorrow, and he is low, and feels it dull over the livery stable yard, and is distinctly aware of a dint in his heart, made by the most adorable of the adorable bridesmaids. For, the poor little harmless gentleman once had his fancy, like the rest of us, and she didn't answer, as she often does not, and he thinks the adorable bridesmaid is like the fancy as she was then, which she is not at all, and that if the fancy had not married some one else for money, but had married him for love, he and she would have been happy, which they wouldn't have been, and that she has a tenderness for him still, whereas her toughness is a proverb. Brooding over the fire, with his dried little head in his dried little hands, and his dried little elbows on his dried little knees, Twemlow is melancholy. No adorable to bear me company here, thinks he. No adorable at the club. A waste, a waste, a waste, my Twemlow. And so drops asleep, and has galvanic starts all over him. Betimes next morning, that horrible old Lady Tippins, relict of the late Sir Thomas Tippins, knighted in mistake for somebody else by His Majesty King George III, who, while performing the ceremony, was graciously pleased to observe, What? Who? Why, he begins to be dyed and varnished for the interesting occasion. She has a reputation for giving smart accounts of things, and she must be at these people's early, my dear, to lose nothing of the fun. Whereabout in the bonnet and drapery announced by her name, any fragment of the real woman may be concealed, is perhaps known to her maid, but you could easily buy all you see of her, in Bond Street, or you might scalp her, and peel her, and scrape her, and make 2 Lady Tippinses out of her, and yet not penetrate to the genuine article. She has a large gold eyeglass, has Lady Tippins, to survey the proceedings with. If she had one in each eye, it might keep that other drooping lid up, and look more uniform. But perennial youth is in her artificial flowers, and her list of lovers is full. Mortimer, you wretch, says Lady Tippins, turning the eyeglass about and about, where is your charge, the bridegroom? Give you my honor, returns Mortimer, I don't know, and I don't care. Miserable! Is that the way you do your duty? Beyond an impression that he is to sit upon my knee and be seconded at some point of the solemnities, like a principal at a prize-fight, I assure you I have no notion what my duty is, returns Mortimer. Eugene is also in attendance, with a pervading air upon him of having presupposed the ceremony to be a funeral, and of being disappointed. The scene is the vestry room of St. James's Church, with a number of leathery old registers on shelves, that might be bound in Lady Tippins's. But, hark! A carriage at the gate, and Mortimer's man arrives, looking rather like a spurious Mephistopheles and an unacknowledged member of that gentleman's family, whom Lady Tippins, surveying through her eyeglass, considers a fine man, and quite a catch, and of whom Mortimer remarks, in the lowest spirits, as he approaches, I believe this is my fellow, confound him. More carriages at the gate, and lo the rest of the characters, whom Lady Tippins, standing on a cushion, surveying through the eyeglass, thus checks off. Bride, 45 a day, 30 shillings a yard, veil £15, pocket handkerchief a present. Bridesmaids, kept down for fear about shining bride, consequently not girls, 12 and sixpence a yard, Veneering's flowers, snub-nosed one rather pretty but too conscious of her stockings, bonnets £3.10. Twemlow, blessed release for the dear man if she really was his daughter, nervous even under the pretense that she is, well he may be. Mrs. Veneering, never saw such velvet, say £2,000 as she stands, absolute jeweller's window, father must have been a pawnbroker, or how could these people do it? Attendant unknowns, pokey. Ceremony performed, register signed, Lady Tippins escorted out of sacred edifice by Veneering, carriages rolling back to Stucconia, servants with favours and flowers, Veneering's house reached, drawing rooms most magnificent. Here, the Podsnaps await the happy party, Mr. Podsnap, with his hairbrushes made the most of, that imperial rocking horse, Mrs. Podsnap, majestically skittish. Here, too, are Boots and Brewer, and the two other buffers, each buffer with a flower in his buttonhole, his hair curled, and his gloves buttoned on tight, apparently come prepared, if anything had happened to the bridegroom, to be married instantly. Here, too, the bride's aunt and next relation, a widowed female of a Medusa sort, in a stony cap, glaring petrifaction at her fellow creatures. Here, too, the bride's trustee, an oil-cake-fed style of business gentleman with moony spectacles, and an object of much interest. Veneering launching himself upon this trustee as his oldest friend, which makes 7, Twemlow thought, and confidentially retiring with him into the conservatory, it is understood that Veneering is his co-trustee, and that they are arranging about the fortune. Buffers are even overheard to whisper 30,000 poendies, with a smack and a relish suggestive of the very finest oysters. Pokey unknowns, amazed to find how intimately they know Veneering, pluck up spirit, fold their arms, and begin to contradict him before breakfast. What time Mrs. Veneering, carrying baby dressed as a bridesmaid, flits about among the company, emitting flashes of many-colored lightning from diamonds, emeralds, and rubies. The analytical, in course of time achieving what he feels to be due to himself and bringing to a dignified conclusion several quarrels he has on hand with the pastrycook's men, announces breakfast. Dining room no less magnificent than drawing room, tables superb, all the camels out, and all laden. Splendid cake, covered with cupids, silver, and true lovers' knots. Splendid bracelet, produced by Veneering before going down, and clasped upon the arm of bride. Yet nobody seems to think much more of the Veneerings than if they were a tolerable landlord and landlady doing the thing in the way of business at so much ahead. The bride and bridegroom talk and laugh apart, as has always been their manner, and the buffers work their way through the dishes with systematic perseverance, as has always been their manner, and the pokey unknowns are exceedingly benevolent to one another in invitations to take glasses of champagne, but Mrs. Podsnap, arching her mane and rocking her grandest, has a far more deferential audience than Mrs. Veneering, and Podsnap all but does the honors. Another dismal circumstance is, that Veneering, having the captivating Tippins on one side of him and the bride's aunt on the other, finds it immensely difficult to keep the peace. For, Medusa, besides unmistakingly glaring petrifaction at the fascinating Tippins, follows every lively remark made by that dear creature, with an audible snort, which may be referable to a chronic cold in the head, but may also be referable to indignation and contempt. And this snort being regular in its reproduction, at length comes to be expected by the company, who make embarrassing pauses when it is falling due, and by waiting for it, render it more emphatic when it comes. The stony aunt has likewise an injurious way of rejecting all dishes whereof Lady Tippins partakes, saying aloud when they are proffered to her, "No, no, no, not for me. Take it away." As with a set purpose of implying a misgiving that if nourished upon similar meats, she might come to be like that charmer, which would be a fatal consummation. Aware of her enemy, Lady Tippins tries a youthful sally or two, and tries the eyeglass, but, from the impenetrable cap and snorting armor of the stony aunt all weapons rebound powerless. Another objectionable circumstance is, that the pokey unknowns support each other in being unimpressible. They persist in not being frightened by the gold and silver camels, and they are banded together to defy the elaborately chased ice pails. They even seem to unite in some vague utterance of the sentiment that the landlord and landlady will make a pretty good profit out of this, and they almost carry themselves like customers. Nor is there compensating influence in the adorable bridesmaids, for, having very little interest in the bride, and none at all in one another, those lovely beings become, each one of her own account, depreciatingly contemplative of the millinery present, while the bridegroom's man, exhausted, in the back of his chair, appears to be improving the occasion by penitentially contemplating all the wrong he has ever done. The difference between him and his friend Eugene being that the latter, in the back of his chair, appears to be contemplating all the wrong he would like to do, particularly to the present company. In which state of affairs, the usual ceremonies rather droop and flag, and the splendid cake when cut by the fair hand of the bride has but an indigestible appearance. However, all the things indispensable to be said are said, and all the things indispensable to be done are done, including Lady Tippens's yawning, falling asleep, and waking insensible, and there is hurried preparation for the nuptial journey to the Isle of Wight, and the outer air teems with brass bands and spectators, in full sight of whom the malignant star of the analytical has preordained that pain and ridicule shall befall him. For he, standing on the doorsteps to grace the departure, is suddenly caught a most prodigious thump on the side of his head with a heavy shoe, which a buffer in the hall, champagne-flushed and wild of aim, has borrowed on the spur of the moment from the pastry cook's porter, to cast after the departing pair as an auspicious omen. So they all go up again into the gorgeous drawing-rooms, all of them flushed with breakfast, as having taken scarlatina sociably, and there the combined unknowns do malignant things with their legs to ottomans, and take as much as possible out of the splendid furniture. And so, Lady Tippens, quite undetermined whether today is the day before yesterday, or the day after tomorrow, or the week after next, fades away, and Mortimer Lightwood and Eugene fade away, and Twemlow fades away, and the stony ant goes away, she declines to fade, proving rocked to the last, and even the unknowns are slowly strained off, and it is all over. All over, that is to say, for the time being. But there is another time to come, and it comes in about a fortnight, and it comes to Mr. and Mrs. Lamel on the sands at Shanklin, in the Isle of Wight. Mr. and Mrs. Lamel have walked for some time on the Shanklin sands, and one may see by their footprints that they have not walked arm in arm, and that they have not walked in a straight track, and that they have walked in a moody humor, for the lady has prodded little spurting holes in the damp sand before her with her parasol, and the gentleman has trailed his stick after him, as if he were of the Mephistopheles family indeed, and had walked with a drooping tail. Do you mean to tell me, then, Sophronia? Thus he begins after a long silence, when Sophronia flashes fiercely, and turns upon him. Don't put it upon me, sir. I ask you, do you mean to tell me? Mr. Lamel falls silent again, and they walk as before. Mrs. Lamel opens her nostrils and bites her underlip. Mr. Lamel takes his gingerous whiskers in his left hand, and, bringing them together, frowns furtively at his beloved, out of a thick gingerous bush. Do I mean to say? Mrs. Lamel after a time repeats, with indignation. Putting it on me. The unmanly disingenuousness. Mr. Lamel stops, releases his whiskers, and looks at her. The what? Mrs. Lamel haughtily replies, without stopping, and without looking back. The meanness. He is at her side again in a pace or two, and he retorts, that is not what you said. You said disingenuousness. What if I did? There is no if in the case. You did. I did, then. And what of it? What of it, says Mr. Lamel. Have you the face to utter the word to me? The face, too, replied Mrs. Lamel, staring at him with cold scorn. Pray, how dare you, sir, utter the word to me? I never did. As this happens to be true, Mrs. Lamel is thrown on the feminine resource of saying, I don't care what you uttered or did not utter. After a little more walking and a little more silence, Mr. Lamel breaks the latter. You shall proceed in your own way. You claim a right to ask me, do I mean to tell you? Do I mean to tell you what? That you are a man of property? No. Then you married me on false pretenses? So be it. Next comes what you mean to say. Do you mean to say you are a woman of property? No. Then you married me on false pretenses. If you were so dull a fortune hunter that you deceived yourself, or if you were so greedy and grasping that you were over-willing to be deceived by appearances, is it my fault, you adventurer? The lady demands, with great asperity.